The early part of the Civil War, of course, is well, warfare. When we think of wars today, we're thinking of soldiers on battlefields and in combat on a regular basis. Soldiers today in a war will average combat, somewhere in the range of 300 days a year that they're in a combat situation. During the American Civil War, soldiers were probably in combat situations maybe 5 days a year. But there's a lot of dead time for the armies. So as we go through the early part of the war, one of the biggest things that is occurring is simply that the two sides are just trying to get themselves organized and get their armies put together, get them trained. So not a great deal of large battles, a lot of small ones, but not large ones. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time with the battles, but rather give you an idea of who the two sides are. I don't want to assume that everybody knows, so I'll take you through that as well as the politics of organizing an army and kind of the strategies that are being developed. The two sides, of course, as I go through this, I'll try and refer to the North as the Union or as the North. Another common term that is applied to them in history books are the Federals, representing the Federal Army. These guys wore typically blue uniforms. As the war progressed, the North does go to a standardized uniform so that they could, they found out very quickly that having different uniforms, because every state and every community raised their own regiment. So they outfitted their soldiers however they wanted to. It wasn't a situation like today where you join the Army and you get a uniform just like everybody else. No. Each regiment would have somewhat unique markings. So, but they do go to a standardized uniform because all those unique markings sometimes could get confusing on the battlefield. Okay? There might have been at the early part of the war guys wearing gray who were fighting for the Union and guys wearing blue who were fighting for the Confederacy. Pretty hard to deal with on the battlefield. One of the nicknames the Northerners have is Yankees. Okay? And that's a reference, of course, back to the Civil War of the English. For the South, their formal name, of course, is the Confederate States of America. You'll see reference to them as the CSA. They wore typically gray, but unlike the North, the South does not go to standardized uniforms because they just don't have the resources. So throughout much of the war, for most Southerners, they were wearing whatever they had on their backs. There was no formal uniform. And of course, they're called rebels. Why do they fight? This, of course, is one question that's been heavily discussed recently, and it's difficult to answer because the vast majority of soldiers could not write. So it's hard for historians to look back and say, and get a consensus of why soldiers fought in the Civil War, because only the few educated were able to write their words down. And what that means, of course, obviously, is what we know about from the written word is that that's what the educated individuals were fighting for, which is typically going to be different than the average commoner. So for Northerners, what we do know is the vast majority of them opposed emancipation or opposed the freeing of the slaves. So for Northerners, it's not about slavery, okay? For the most part. It is about the Union, and that's, of course, what Lincoln preaches about the war, that this is a war about preserving the Union. It's not a war about ending slavery. Because he believes, number one, secession is unconstitutional. You can't secede, you can't leave. And number two, that if the Union fails, then the United States of America fails. And if the United States of America fails, democracy may fail. Okay? So again, it's one of those things that's often overlooked at the circumstances that were taking place in the rest of the world and the influence that it was having on America at the time. In the rest of the world, you're seeing European countries moving away from democracy. They're moving away from the idea that people can govern themselves and are going back to dictators and kings and queens. For example, France went through a revolution in 1789. By the 1850s, they're back to a monarch. And their people are very willing to give up their rights and their freedoms so that they can live in safety. Okay? Regardless if they're being persecuted or not. And that was pretty typical in the rest of Europe. If America fails, in Lincoln's eyes, democracy would fail. It would be a failure of the people of America to govern themselves. And if America failed, democracy may no longer exist on the face of the earth. Okay, so it's, in that perspective, very huge ramifications for the Union. For the South, Shelby Foote, the author of many books on the Civil War, put it probably the best that I've ever seen. He tells the story of a Southern soldier who was approached by a Northern soldier after being captured. And many were wondering why Southerners were fighting this war. Because in Northerners' eyes, they viewed it as a war to protect the rich of the South. So he walks up to this Southern soldier and says, why are you fighting this war? And the Southerner looked him straight in the eye and says, I'm fighting this war because you're down here. And that's probably the best way to explain it for most Southerners. Is they were fighting the Civil War to prevent Northerners from coming into their states and telling them how to live their lives. Whether it's slavery, anything else, that was more important. They didn't want to be dictated to. So that's the fear of disrupted society. They didn't want their world turned upside down by outsiders. Comparing the two, in general comparisons, neither side has a military advantage. Some people always argue that the South had great military leaders. They do. And probably more experienced military leaders. But the Union had great military leaders as well. They just don't use them in the way that the South does. And it takes a little bit longer. So militarily, if you look at it, the Union has the advantage because the Union has greater resources. And they have the larger ability to expand their industrial capabilities, produce their own goods. And that's seen here. In the North, you have 110,000 factories. In the South, you have 110,000 factory workers. Okay? Most Southerners were farmers. Most Southerners relied on the North for their manufactured goods. So as the war progressed, it was going to be more paramount that the South had the ability to get their materials from somewhere. And the only place they could really get them from was the North, or smuggle them in from Europe, which are pretty successful. The South has an advantage in motivation. Okay? They have to defend their homeland. Obviously, much more of a motivation than being an attacking army on foreign soil. All right? Population-wise, 22 million people. This one gives you an idea of the Southern population. When the Army of the Potomac was in the South, ranging from 75,000 to 125,000 soldiers at any different time, the Army of the Potomac was the second largest city in the southern states. Okay? It's kind of like Memorial Stadium being the third largest city in Nebraska on Saturdays. It gives you an idea of the population density. In the South, there just wasn't a lot of people in one area. They're spread out over the rural areas. The South lacks an effective transportation system, very few railroads. So their ability to move troops and materials from one theater to the other is not very effective. The North, Lincoln takes great advantage of his military resources and shipping large materials from the east to the west and the west to the east, wherever they are needed. All right, the first battle of the Civil War, of course, is Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor in South Carolina in 1861 on April the 12th. And basically what had happened was that after secession in December of 1860, the federal government, the United States government, had been in the process of giving up their military bases in most of the port cities, Mobile, Alabama, Savannah, Georgia, and so forth. James Buchanan, the president at the time, was doing nothing to try and prevent secession. When Abraham Lincoln takes office, as I said, he did not believe secession was legal. So he stops the process of vacating those military forts, and he takes a stand at Fort Sumter. And the back and forth between Lincoln and Jefferson Davis of the Confederacy to try and negotiate some type of agreement, Lincoln's not going to give in, and it results in the Confederates deciding to begin bombardment. The Union would surrender at Fort Sumter, and the war had begun. Okay? Immediately following Fort Sumter, Lincoln calls for 75,000 90-day volunteers, because his army consisted of only about 160,000, and most of them were in the West, California, Nebraska, places like that. Now, this is the one event, when people talk about the Civil War, there are those who say that Lincoln started it. And I think there's some merit to that. Did Lincoln create a situation to try and coerce the Southerners into firing the first shot? Maybe, okay? And if you ever read more on Lincoln and learn about his political mind, I think you would find yourself probably saying, yeah, that's something that he would do. Try and get them to be the agitator. Try and get the South to be the aggressor. Once he calls for troops, the border states, we'll talk about in a little bit, begin seceding. And there's a map of Charleston Harbor. And you can see the significance of Fort Sumter. If you control Fort Sumter, you're controlling the inlet into Charleston Harbor. And if you're going to go to war with the Confederacy and you want to keep them from getting any supplies, one of the places you're going to want to influence is Charleston Harbor, the biggest port city in the South. Okay? Raising an army. And these armies are massive. Okay? For many, this is somewhat the first modern war. I'll let you look at those numbers a little bit. When you start into consideration of the percentage of individuals to today, okay? So this would be like the United States having an army of 30 million. I don't think we're even close to a million today. Maybe pushing 600, 700, 800,000. 30 million people in the military. Okay? For the South, it's even greater. The South mobilized 80% of its male population. So when we talk about male population, we're talking about little ones to old ones. 80% of them are mobilized for war. So when you think about that, that's a lot of men. Now think about the burden that is placed upon Southern society with 80% of their male population at war. What does the female population now have to do? Everything. I mean, everything. They're running the plantation. Well, not the plantation, because the rich guys didn't have to go. But they're running the small farms. And heavy burden is placed upon the women of the South. You see here that the first year of the war is the greatest amount of volunteers. And that's because, of course, wars tended to be that way. You can go through about every American war, and when the war breaks out, everybody wants to join up. Okay? And then as time passes, you start to see a decline in those volunteers. And that's what we see happen here in the Civil War. Everybody joins up in the first year. After that, they figure out, oh, maybe this isn't for me. Okay? Another unique element of the Civil War, and something that the U.S. government never does again after it, is all the units of the Civil War are raised locally. So the federal government would ask Nebraska, for example, to raise 5,000 troops. And Nebraska would then go send it out to their counties and say, Clay County, you need 1,000 troops for this enlistment period. That's a lot. Yeah, that's a lot. You know the hypothetical number. And Clay County might say, okay, Sutton, you're one of the bigger cities in Clay County. You've got to produce 200 soldiers. All right, which you would do. And those 200 soldiers would go into battle together. They would stay together all the time. Good thing? Yeah, because you got your buddies around you. Grady says no. Why? You watch your friends die. Or, if you're like the Mississippi Grays, and many other units, but the Mississippi Grays is probably one of the most well known. Anybody ever wonder why the University of Mississippi calls itself the Rebels? Civil War, but it has more meaning than that. When the war broke out, a large portion of the population, male population of the University of Mississippi, joined the Confederate Army and went to war. And after the third day, when they took part in Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, none of them are alive. Okay? So it is possible, and what did happen, that you get caught on the battlefield, you get caught on the wrong portion of the battlefield, your entire male population of your community between the ages of 18 and 35 could be dead. They're not coming home. Another interesting statistic is Spotsylvania County in Virginia. Spotsylvania County, it took them 70 years to equal the same number of males living in their county. It took them 70 years to equal that same point as it existed in 1860. Does that make sense? They had lost so many men in that county that it wasn't until 70 years later that they had an equal number of men living in that county as they had in 1860. Okay? So it was potentially, for communities, potentially a catastrophe. Strategies. I'm going to talk about I got a map here for the Union. The Confederate strategy is very similar to that of the Continental strategy in the Revolutionary War. That simply don't lose. Easier said than done. But pick your battles. Find your places where you want to fight. That's why I have offensive, defensive, or defensive, offensive. Is most of the time fight a defensive war. Just move your armies where you can protect them best and try and win as many battles as you can. Don't go on the offensive. Don't try and invade the north, because that's going to overextend you and potentially lead to your defeat. Okay? They combined their forces. They were outnumbered, especially as the war goes on, so they were very, very skillful in taking units from the Eastern Theater, moving them to the west when things got tough out there, and then moving them back to the east when they were needed in that situation. And then the commanders realized, when I'm at low numbers, I've got to kind of go high. Right? For the Union, the war becomes a war of conquest. They had the greatest challenge. Because to win this war, they have to conquer. They have to basically occupy all of this territory. And we look at it and say, well, that's not a lot of land. But in terms of the world, it is a lot of land. It's equivalent to basically Western Europe. And in the 1860s, no nation had ever successfully conquered and occupied and controlled a landmass that size. Okay? They're going to blockade. That's what the snake represents, partially. No supplies coming in and out. Throughout the war, though, smuggling becomes very effective. About 50% of all ships that try and get through the blockade make it through. So the blockade isn't as successful as they would like to believe. And then also Mexico becomes very, very important in the trade route for the Confederacy. Then they were going to control the Mississippi River and then start to attack deep into the south. Okay? It's called Scott's Great Snake because it is developed by Winfield Scott, who was the commander of the Union Army at the beginning of the war, and representing an anaconda, or a constrictor snake that squeezes its enemy to death. The first major land battle occurs on July 21st, 1861. All right? Lincoln basically is forcing Irwin McDowell to push his army southward and put pressure on the Confederates. And early on, what we see happen in the battle is you see a push, okay? This is kind of where the battle started, with the two armies like this. And you see the Union make a big push, and it looked like by midday, early afternoon, that the Union is going to win the war. These armies are very inexperienced, untrained, so both sides you see early in the first Battle of Bull Run, you see a lot of, when the first shots are fired and you start to see the bodies falling around you, a lot of them take off and run, okay? And then they would regroup, at least the Confederates did. Late in the day, right down here, Thomas Jackson, leading the Virginians, makes a stand, okay? And then he receives the nickname Stonewall as an observer, seeing him make that stand. And then the Confederates are able to push back the Union. And once things started going bad for the Union, it's chaos. The army basically breaks apart. In northern newspapers, they refer to the first Battle of Bull Run as the Great Skedaddle, because literally, some of those guys took off running and ran all the way back to Washington, D.C., which is about probably 20 miles, maybe. But the impact of this battle is that both sides realize very quickly that it's going to be a long, long war. All right, the border state issue. After Lincoln calls for volunteers, after the battle or after the bombardment of Fort Sumter, the issue, these states, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, Florida, that was the Confederacy in April of 1861. Okay? Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, and Kentucky and Missouri had not seceded. So the concern is, well, after Lincoln calls for those troops, Virginia secedes, North Carolina secedes, Tennessee secedes, and Arkansas secedes. They all leave the Union. And one interesting fact about Virginia is, people wonder, well, why didn't these states secede with the rest of them? Well, Virginia decided not to secede after Lincoln's election because they felt that slavery was protected more under the U.S. Constitution than it was under whatever new government was going to be created. They felt safer with slavery under the U.S. government than a new government. So, Lincoln realizes those states are going to be important. So he begins the process of trying to secure as many as he possibly can. Kentucky is important because it borders, of course, runs along the Ohio River. And if you can take these border states, obviously you're going to have less land that you have to conquer. If you can take it now and take it quick, then that gets you closer to the deep south. All right? Kentucky, Lincoln's birthplace. His family, or his wife's family, still lives in Kentucky. Abraham Lincoln would have two brother-in-laws that would fight for the Confederacy. John J. Crittenden, a senator from Kentucky, would have a son that fights for the Confederacy and a son that fights for the Union. And this is pretty common in those border states, that you would have family members going both directions and meeting each other on the battlefield. Leonidas Polk in 1861 decides to occupy and control Kentucky. So Kentucky stays with the Union. Missouri erupts in guerrilla warfare. It will eventually stay with the Union, but not after some pretty brutal situation. Missouri's got a lot of rich Civil War history, especially in the southern part of the state. But throughout the war, Missouri will be a battlefield of the guerrillas. Okay? These are non-formal military troops led by William Quantrill and others, and it is here that guys like Frank and Jesse James get their start in their career as outlaws. Maryland, of course, is very important because it surrounds the Capital District. It surrounds Washington, D.C. If Maryland does not go with the Union, then Washington, D.C. would be surrounded. So Lincoln takes aggressive action to make sure that it stays with the Union. West Virginia did not exist in terms of the state. It existed as western part of Virginia. But when the Civil War begins and Virginia secedes, that part of Virginia decides to stay with the Union. Lincoln quickly recognizes it, sends troops into that region, led by George McClellan, and it becomes a state in 1863. As you can see, number-wise, a lot of people fought on both sides from those border states. Okay. Financing the war, preparing. Where does the money come from? Well, this is something new for the United States. This turns a massive economic and military mobilization, how you're going to pay for it. And as you can see in the U.S. government budget in 1860 was $63 million. In 1865, both sides would spend somewhere in the range of $2.5 billion. That's massive spending increase that the people are not used to. Because in the United States in 1860, most people did not pay taxes of any kind, because they didn't have a great deal of government spending. That's going to change. All right? With this massive spending increase, you're going to see inflation. You're going to see increase in prices. The Union is much better at controlling it. Okay? We see inflation of about 8% in the Union. In the Confederacy, that's not a misprint up there. Inflation is around 9,000%. The basic needs and supplies for Confederates and for Southerners become very difficult to obtain because nobody has money. All right. The last part of it here, when you think about the cost of the war, this is, to some people, this is kind of the beginning point of a very aggressive and big government mentality in the United States. As you progress through the Civil War, the average American citizen became very, very comfortable with having the government in their life. Prior to the Civil War, most citizens of the United States had no direct connection to their government at all. But as you go through the war, the governments on both sides become much, much more aggressive. Okay? Conscription. Conscription, of course, is a draft, forcing people into the military. Both sides will use it. Both sides will have elements of ways of getting out. Both sides will try and punish those people who avoid the draft. Okay? There are bounties out for draft dodgers. The Union goes to the draft in mid-March of 1863, but only 46,000 would ever be drafted. Both sides use the draft more as an encourager to volunteer. Because if you volunteer, you have somewhat control of your direction. If you didn't volunteer, then you could not control your directives. Meaning that if you volunteered, you could kind of dictate what unit you were going to and where you might be going. If you were drafted, they were going to put you where they wanted to. So if you were a 9-month enlistment, you walked in and said, I want to go for 9 months, and they said, great, we'll sign you up for 9 months. The next day you're on a train for a battlefield. Very little training whatsoever. If you're a 3-year enlistment, they're going to give you probably some training. Okay? So they're going to use up your 9-monthers first. The Confederates. The Union pays for a lot of the war through bonds. Okay? They get people to invest and buy war bonds. But the advantage that the Union had is they had a thriving economy. The northern economy explodes during the war because they're manufacturing all the war materials. So people are making a lot of money off of government contracts. They're able to take that money and invest it into war bonds. The South doesn't have that. Their economy is rapidly declining during the war. Their people are running out of cash. So the only way that the government could get any money out of the people was to force it out, right? Under their Constitution, of course, they were a confederacy. They were going to ask the states for money. But as the war progressed, states like Georgia simply quit providing anything to the Confederate government. Georgia wouldn't even provide soldiers because their Governor Brown decided we're going to defend Georgia first. Okay? They became very, very selfish in that manner. So the Confederate government is forced to go to taxes, very high taxes. They taxed everything. And then they also began the process of impressment, where they basically ran around, came to your farm, and if you had anything that they needed, they took it. Maybe they paid for it, but they probably gave you Confederate dollars, which weren't worth a whole lot. Okay, talk a little bit more about conscription. The bounties, substitutes. Both sides had the ability to get out of the war through the use of substitutes. In the North, you had to pay about $300, okay? Which for most people that's a lot of money back then. So it was only something to get the rich out of it. Guys like Teddy Roosevelt's dad paid a substitute. In the South, you could pay your way out with cash, and then they also had exemptions for anybody who owned 20 slaves or more. So again, if you were a wealthy plantation owner, you and your kids were probably exempt from ever having to fight in the Confederate War. Thus, the term, the phrase, rich man's war, poor man's fight. The Confederates conscript a lot more, and they have greater restrictions. Even if you buy a substitute, okay, you only have a year and a half before you're eligible for the draft again, and then you would have to buy another substitute, simply because they don't have enough men, or as many men as the Northerners. All right, impact of especially conscription. Well, obviously people ran. More people went to Canada during the Civil War to escape the draft than they did during the Vietnam War. And everybody is probably maybe more familiar with that event. Confederates replaced their troops. So after every battle, they would bring in as many new troops as they could. The Union did not. They bled those units down. Again, an example of how they, the potential of wiping out a community. And then they would replace an entire division or an entire regiment. Okay? And then you had safe havens like Clearfield County, Pennsylvania, where people went to hide out from the government. All right. Getting into the war here a little bit. 1862, as I said. 1861, you have the First Battle of Bull Run. 1862, we're going to see a great deal more progression in the war, and things will begin developing. And we see the emergence of key commanders. Okay? And I have it written here. And I'm just going to kind of talk about these. And as I go through them, I'll talk about the Union side, then I'll go through the Confederate side. Let's start with these two, Grant and Sherman. Okay? In the Civil War, you have two major theaters. You have the Western Theater along the Mississippi, and then you have the Eastern Theater in Virginia and that area. And the Western Theater for the Union is probably the most important because they wanted to capture the Mississippi first. So we see the most aggressive actions being taken in that area. And Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, a guy that has basically been a failure in life. He's working for his dad at a leather shop in Galena, Illinois when the war breaks out. Quickly becomes one of the Union's best leaders. He wins battles at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson on the Mississippi River. Is actually fired and removed from his command because his commander is jealous of his success, and then would be reinstated and continues that success on down the Mississippi. William Tecumseh Sherman becomes a close friend of Grant's, Sherman actually, in the early part of the war, is sent home because people think he's nuts. And he probably was, a little bit. But they send him home as they believe he has some serious mental issues. And then they decide, well, it's a civil war, we need him. He was a good military leader. They bring him back. One of the key battles in 1862 in the West is Shiloh in Tennessee. And this is probably the first time that we'll see the horrific numbers of casualties that exist, and we'll see pretty common throughout the rest of the war. But somewhere in the range of 15,000 killed in those 2 days in April 1862. But in the West, these two guys are making great strides in 1861, the Union is definitely winning the war in the West. In 1862 as well, David Farragut leads Union ships to capture New Orleans. So they're slowly progressing up and down the Mississippi. In the East, it's a mess. Okay? You have a lot of commanders. And the reason you have a lot of commanders here is because they all fail. Okay? Irwin McDowell is beat at First Bull Run. He gets fired. They put George McClellan into command of the Army of the Potomac. He takes his time. He develops. He's very methodical, very hesitant. He was a guy that believed he always had to have superior numbers, but he always convinced himself he never had. I'll tell you a little bit. But he goes on a big crusade on the Peninsula Campaign in the spring of 1862, in which one of the best stories of his hesitation is he surrounded the town of Yorktown, and his army was somewhere in the range of 100,000 soldiers, and he convinced himself that they had over 100,000 soldiers in Yorktown. So he doesn't attack. He places it under siege. And then once the Confederates pull out, he goes in and realizes that they probably only had about 10,000 soldiers there, because all the cannons that he thought existed were nothing more than tree stumps painted black. He fails at the Peninsula Campaign. He's fired. They put in place John Pope. He irresponsibly just takes off south, gets his butt kicked at Second Bull Run. He's fired. They put in place Ambrose Burnside. No, George McClellan comes back. Okay, they bring him back, and he actually wins the Battle of Antietam, so to speak. But his hesitation to clean up after the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln fires him again, puts Burnside into command. He gets routed at Fredericksburg, and at the end of 1862, we're sitting there with Joseph Hooker. Okay? So, in the East, which was probably it was a more popular theater because you're closer to New York City and those places. Things are not going well for the Union, but in the West they're going great. Confederate commanders, Albert Sidney Johnston is the commander of the West. He is killed at Shiloh. Story of his death, he gets shot in the leg, is bleeding a lot. He's bleeding a lot from his leg and bleeds to death. And basically the only reason he bled to death is because he sent his surgeon to go work on Union casualties rather than be by his side. So they lose a big one there. Joseph E. Johnston is considered to be the greatest military mind in the South at the time as far as field commander. Robert E. Lee, who will become the icon of the South, he's serving as Jefferson Davis's military aide. Okay, we'll get back to him. Joseph Johnston's leading that army against those commanders in the East. He's winning victories, but he is wounded in the 7 Days battles on the Peninsula Campaign, and enter Robert E. Lee. And Lee, of course, probably the most respected military mind in the United States at the time. He is actually given command. Lincoln offers him command of the Union Army when the Civil War begins, and he turns that down. But he will go on to, of course, great heroism. Here's Beauregard, of Fort Sumter fame, of First Bull Run fame. He kind of runs all over the theater. So he's going back and forth wherever they need him. Very capable leader. Here's Stonewall Jackson, who will become Lee's right-hand man, and probably one of the, in the Peninsula campaign especially, as Johnston and Lee are fighting on the Peninsula, Thomas Jackson is running his army ragged, marches of 50 to 100 miles a day. Imagine that, by foot. He's running them up and down the Shenandoah Valley to occupy an army that was supposed to surround the Army of Northern Virginia on the peninsula. And then Jeb Stuart, the great cavalry commander, the eyes of Lee. During the 7 days, he's running around the Union Army trying to figure out where they're at and coming back and giving Lee great information. These guys are considered very, very skillful because they're having successes. The other the Union commanders are very good, but not as aggressive. Okay? All right. One of the biggest battles of the 1862 campaign is Antietam. Bloodiest single day in American history. As we see in the range of 23,000 casualties on a single day, September. Lee actually is marching north. And I'll talk more about the battles later. But Antietam is very, very bloody. Very fierce fighting. One of the battles where Lee really doesn't take a defensive strategy, but somewhat more aggressive. He loses the battle. He's forced to retreat from Antietam in Maryland. The significance of Antietam is that this was the event Lincoln was looking for to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. He proposes it in the summer of 1862. His advisors, William Seward and others, say, no, don't do it. It looks like a last-ditch effort because we're losing the war. Lincoln says, okay, all I need is a victory. He gets that, what he perceives victory at Antietam. Why does he issue the Emancipation Proclamation? Does he want to free the slaves? No. He does it for political purposes. Okay? On the day Antietam is fought, in September of 1862, France and Great Britain in their governments are discussing recognizing the Confederacy and intervening in the war to end it. Okay? So Europeans are looking at trying to stop the American Civil War with a division between North and South. Lincoln has to keep them out. Okay? How do you do that? You make it a war about slavery. The Europeans aren't going to touch that with a 10-foot pole because they don't have slavery. Okay? That's the motivation. The other thing is it would hurt Southern economic capabilities. Okay? If you can disrupt Southern economy, that's going to help you a great deal. It only freed the slaves in the territory still under rebel control. Okay? So, that changes the direction of the war. The war is now moving towards something higher. Even though Lincoln's really not intending it, so to speak, he's just trying to use whatever tools he has necessary to try and get disruption and earn a victory. Okay? Question? I know that was quick. That should have took about 5 days.
Yeah, 10 and 300, right?
Well, and one.